Welcome to the Faith and Feelings podcast. My name is Taylor Joy, and I'm passionate about helping you untangle and honor your emotions, authentically practice your faith, and integrate both into your everyday life so that you can experience the goodness and delight that comes from living in relationship with yourself, God, and others. Thank you for joining me. Let's get started. Over the last 2 months, we've been in a series called When Life Doesn't Make Sense. I've been hosting conversations with wise, deeply authentic, and kind people about their stories of pain and sorrow, and what they've learned about hope, lament, joy, and courage when life gets really hard. My hope has been that these conversations offer words and phrases that capture the emotions of your heart and give voice to your pain. These episodes have touched on so many topics, ranging from miscarriage to abuse to the death of lifelong dreams. As I've hosted and held these stories, editing them and pulling out themes and prepping them for release, I've been reflecting on so much. One of the things I've been learning is that our response to suffering, the story we tell ourselves, the habits we engage to cope and make our way through, and the company we pull in or push away in the midst of it, profoundly influences what we believe and who we become. So next week, I'll be wrapping up this series with some key things that I've been pondering in regards to a theology of suffering. But I didn't want to end this series before offering one of my own stories when life didn't make sense. I had several different stories and experiences in mind that I could share today. But one topic that I kept coming back to and that we haven't engaged with in this series yet has been mental health struggles. Anxiety and an eating disorder have been a painful part of my story. So to prepare for this episode, I spent some time this week sitting in these experiences and answering some of the questions that I've asked guests on this series. While this episode is about eating disorders, my hope is to put some words to the mind battle and deep emotional pain that comes with the general experience of mental illness or addiction. Over the last 6 years of recovering from an eating disorder, I've known one thing to be true. Mental health struggles are difficult to describe, and they can be exhausting to live with. It's a daily waking up to an inner battle that can be overwhelmingly unnoticed by others, and there is a certain strength that is required to endure pain that lingers, especially when it's unseen. This experience can be both lonely and deeply disorienting. So whether you see some of yourself in my story, or whether you're listening on behalf of a loved one, I hope that my story will invite connection. Maybe through a deep exhale of knowing that you're not alone, or perhaps through a greater understanding of the mind and soul of someone that you long to help but struggle to recognize anymore. I distinctly remember the first time I learned that something called eating disorders even existed. I think I was 5 or 6 at the time, and I was known in my family for this deep belly laugh and this bold, confident way of expressing my thoughts and opinions without hesitation. I was fairly outspoken and took myself very seriously, but I had this vibrant, whole person way of engaging life. One afternoon, I remember reading a picture book about a girl who had an eating disorder. As the book described what an eating disorder was, I remember feeling shocked. I recall thinking to myself, why would anyone ever deprive themselves of food? I inwardly resolved that whatever she had would not be part of my story. The irony of that moment is painful. But the beginning of my battle with food didn't really start with food at all. It began with an attempt to self-numb and to find some form of control in a very unstable, chaotic few years of high school. The first time I began to wonder if something was wrong, if something was deeply broken inside of me, was when I was 16. I had been hospitalized for some unexplainable physical symptoms that were eventually connected to stress. But since I started writing for publication at a really young age, I had a few writing projects due at the same time. One evening, I sat propped up in my hospital bed, frustrated because I couldn't type through the IVs in my hands. I kept trying to write, so stressed to meet the deadlines, but there was this deeper part of me that was terrified by this strumming motor in my chest that I couldn't turn off no matter how hard I tried. This sense of urgency to run and keep going and don't think and never stop. I felt like my mind and body were existing on two separate planets. There was a deep disconnection between the two. It almost felt like I was a floating head, as if nothing existed from my jawline down. And if something bodily did exist, I only knew how to scrutinize it, as if detached from the outside. My food battle didn't happen overnight. It was a slow progression, a downward spiral of seeking some form of control, some way to self-numb for a twisted form of safety. By the time I was 17, a meal had slowly shifted from a source of nourishment and connection to the source of a trauma, fight, flight, or freeze response. This thing that had initially begun as a coping mechanism to control was now overpowering me in a way that I couldn't understand or explain. The best way that I can describe the daily soundtrack of an eating disorder is like a police station housed deep within your psyche, and its loud speaker shouts negative barbs, ever-changing roles, self-abuse, and guilt-provoking accusations. It's a mind battle, mental chaos. Eating disorders are often described in the counseling world as a slow form of suicide. And that's what it became for me. Being a mental disease, eating disorders rob one of the energy needed to choose good over evil. They can in themselves be deeply traumatizing as you find yourself in a place of powerlessness against your own mind. Daily life had become a slow form of dying, and I didn't know how to stop. I remember lying awake at night and begging God to make me normal. I was angry at myself because, being a perfectionist, I thought that I would have to see this thing through to completion, and that scared me because completion meant death, and I wasn't ready to die. By the time I graduated high school, I had descended into an even darker place. But I was an expert at pretending like I was fine, hence the title of my most recent book, Stop Saying I'm Fine. And there was this part of me that couldn't see how sick I actually was. In the fall of 2016, my sister and I went to Germany for a 6-month biblical studies certification program before our first year of undergrad. Flying to Germany, I remember hoping that maybe, just maybe, I could leave my eating disorder behind. I packed my suitcase and hoped that a change of scenery might loosen the grip of this sickness that had been sucking the life out of me for too long. Why do sentences like that sound so logical when we think them, and yet so silly in reality? When I arrived in Germany, I was immediately immersed in so many new and once-in-a-lifetime opportunities. Hikes in the Alps, backpacking through Paris and Rome during Christmas break. But none of these experiences could stop that downward inner spiral. And one spring morning, I found myself walking through glass doors into a cold, white-walled doctor's office with a staff member from the school. We sat in plastic chairs across from a doctor, and in the span of a brisk, professional, and fact-only conversation, I was labeled severely anorexic. I remember staring at the referral letter that the doctor gave me. My eyes read the words eating disorder and needs treatment immediately and could go into cardiac arrest at any moment. It was like my eyes were seeing those words, but my brain wasn't comprehending what they meant. Life did not make sense. How did this happen? It was then that I finally knew. I was sick. I needed help. I remember walking back to my dorm from the doctor that day, not saying anything. I walked past a lake that wrapped around my college campus, and my eyes wandered to bare, bony trees clustered around the shoreline. I couldn't help but notice their wintry rebellion against a world that screamed life. As the world ushered in the colors of spring, my deadened spirit seemed strikingly out of place. I felt the emptiness of those trees inside. I finished my gap year program, but I wasn't really there for most of it. I was riding a pain escape merry-go-round and not reflecting on much. I just wanted the pain to go away. I was ready to do anything just to make the pain go away. It was as if my capacity to live, to engage in life, had walked out and closed the door. Thinking back now, it almost seemed like I didn't exist anymore. In my place was a desperate, defensive, and hollow version of me, a half-life. One of the questions that I've asked several guests in this series is how they've experienced God's heart and posture towards them in their pain. In previous episodes, I've briefly mentioned the residential treatment facility that I went to a few weeks after finishing that biblical studies program in Germany. During those last few months before being admitted, I was consumed with shame. One Sunday morning, a few days after my diagnosis, I remember sitting in a church service full of people and never feeling more alone. I felt so disconnected from myself, from others, and from God. The pastor had announced that we would be taking communion, and I watched as the bread and cup were passed around the room. Over the last few years, those symbols had become less weighty, less final, less full of wonder and promise, and more so, reminders of sacrificial healing and wholeness, detached from my reality. For a moment, I had lingered on the edge of a church pew. Then, as everyone else partook of the bread and cup, I got up and left. God seemed so far away, so silent. In that moment, I literally could not physically stay in the room. But as I've unpacked that story of leaving church midway through communion, I've begun to realize how it reflected a much deeper, more inward spiritual reality. Physically, part of my body had shrunk as I had become small. I had often sat in a chair with my knees pulled up to my chest, wrapping my arms around my legs like a tight ball. My freedom to think about the world outside the narrow container of my fragile mind had evaporated. My voice, both my inner knowing and the vocal sound a body makes, had faded away, and my ability to want or desire anything had vanished. How that was also true on a deeper spiritual level as well. I had lost any capacity to receive goodness or grace, to receive anything at all. My eating disorder had drained the color from life. I didn't know how to delight, to rest, or to simply be. Uncurling and expanding to receive the abundance of God's table felt just as scary as sitting at a physical table. But during this time, I remember one passage of scripture that God spoke deeply into my heart. It's a story about a little girl that Jesus healed in Mark 5. This little girl was the daughter of a synagogue leader who had begged Jesus to come to his home to heal her when she was sick. As I read this passage just a few days before leaving Germany, it pulled me in unlike any other previous reading. The passage describes Jesus as entering their home after the girl had died. As everyone grieved and wept, he asked the crowd, "Don't you know that the girl is not dead, but merely asleep?" Everyone had laughed at him, thinking that he clearly didn't understand. She was dead. Any hope of healing was lost. He was too late. But going into the little girl's room, the gospel writer describes Jesus as tenderly clasping the little girl's hand in his and whispering to her gently in Aramaic, "Talita kum," which means, "Little girl, wake up from the sleep of death." Immediately, the girl sat up, stood on her feet, and started walking around. Everyone was amazed, and Jesus told them to give her something to eat. I just imagined this scene, this intimate moment shared between this girl and Jesus, the warmth of his hand pressed into hers. And it was as if Jesus was placing a hand in mine, whispering those same words, "Little girl, wake up." As an 18-year-old facing a long and lonely summer in treatment, I held those words deep inside of me like a promise. The next 10 weeks in treatment were excruciatingly difficult. Therapy felt like a slow climb out of a hellish pit of madness and darkness, so vast it was impossible to imagine any other way of being. But as I reflect on it now, those weeks were the beginning of a long journey of waking up again, to life, to healing, to laughter, to leisure, to color. I remember that one of the first homework assignments my therapist gave me was a simple personal inventory. The prompts asked basic questions like, "What's your favorite color?" and "What do you like to do for fun?" I sat with that assignment for hours, staring down at the sheet of paper and then up again at the blank wall in front of me. I didn't know. I had no idea what my favorite color was, and what did fun even feel like. For the last few years, this sickness had so consumed me that I had no idea who I was or what I liked apart from my eating disorder. Over the course of the next 2.5 months, I slowly began reconnecting to the emotions and physical sensations in my body, and I began to realize that they weren't as scary as they initially seemed. One afternoon, in a moment of celebration, I wrote my newly determined favorite color in that blank personal inventory. Ever so slowly, I began noticing the hues of the sun and feeling its heat on my skin for the first time in a long time. The sky shone bluer and brighter. Sunsets became beautiful again, and when I took walks outside, I practiced pausing and simply listening to the birds sing. Slowly, I regained the ability to laugh again. Conversations became richer and deeper, and acts of kindness brought tears to my eyes, where what had existed before was suspicion and numbness. That journey of waking up still continues today. In those first few years after treatment, every day felt like a feat. My focus was simply to take one day at a time, and if that was too overwhelming, one moment at a time. But as time has passed, I've been learning how to reclaim my voice. I've been learning how to rest and how to befriend margin. As I find more grief and compassion for that version of myself who had to be so tucked away, who had tried so hard to disappear, I'm learning how to take up space, to express longings and needs, and to settle more fully into myself. I'm learning how to expand to receive the welcome of God and of others. And I can say that this journey of healing is both wild and nonlinear, both excruciatingly difficult and stunningly beautiful. I often think about the people who've reached out to me after hearing my story at a speaking engagement or through my book. I especially think of the people who've so graciously shared similar parts of their stories with me, and in a conversation or a DM, formed words around that aching question that I've often wondered in my recovery. Will my eating disorder ever go away? Is full recovery possible? Honestly, I hope and pray that it is. But for me, I've experienced how that blaring accusatory voice in my head, which I've since named Ed, has softened to a whisper. So to end, I wanted to speak for a moment to the person listening who may have found some of themselves in my story. Maybe an eating disorder is part of your story too, or perhaps it's anxiety, depression, or a different kind of addiction. If you grew up in a faith context like me, we can often feel so much shame. It can feel like your body is betraying your morality, and no matter how much you pray or trust, you can't seem to start or stop or feel or think whatever you think you should be. But I want you to know that God is not hiding from you. There is no disapproval in His eyes. He's not waiting for you to pull yourself together to love you. He's holding you. He's weeping with you. Your pain grieves Him. There is no part of you that is too broken, lifeless, or lost for Him to seek out. While God's heart for us is freedom and health, His love for us is not dependent on our capacity to experience these things. So what might it look like to just let Him hold you, even if just for a moment? To envision His strong arms wrapped around you and the tears on His face for you. What invitation towards healing might He be extending towards you? And what might it look like to receive this invitation today? Thank you for joining me for today's episode. I'd love to hear from you. Connect with me on Instagram at TaylorJoy. If this conversation was helpful and you'd like more information about my other offerings to engage your story more deeply, check out my website, taylorjoymurray.co.